However you are and whenever you are, welcome good souls of the planet and beyond to Paranormal Now. I'm Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. And tonight we've got a lot of turnoffs. Joining us in the first hour is Dr. Bob Davis, and we'll be discussing his book, Unseen Forces, everything metaphysical, mind meets reality, and what it really is. Who are you, really? And what is this world that we live in? And what are you capable of? We'll cover everything from non-human entities to what Bob calls peak experiences. So for all of you near-death experiencers and psychedelic aficionados, you may know what we are talking about tonight. And then in the second hour, author and independent researcher Katherine Chiljan will be discussing her book, Shakespeare Suppressed. Now, I know that sounds a little different than what we normally would cover on the show, but it is in fact a mystery. And I think if you stay for that second hour, you really appreciate her presentation and what she thinks has happened throughout history to misguide us and misidentify who Shakespeare actually was. And it's a conspiracy in a sense. The question is why? Why is there conspiracy? Why was there conspiracy to cover up who this brilliant artist was? So we'll talk with Katherine in the second hour. And tonight we won't have the open lines in the last 30 minutes. So it'll just be 1 hour with Bob, 1 hour with Katherine. And if you have any questions, hit us up in the chat. I'll keep my eye there on YouTube and Facebook as well. All right. So Dr. Bob Davis, we have a lot to cover. Dr. Bob Davis is an internationally recognized scientist of sensory neuroscience and served as a professor at the State University of New York for over 30 years. And that's where we are located right now, in New York. He earned a PhD in sensory neuroscience from the Ohio State University. He has written 3 books. His 60-plus academic articles appear in peer-reviewed journals, which include the Journal of Scientific Exploration, Journal of Consciousness Studies, Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, Hearing Research, and the Journal of Neuroscience. He has been interviewed by dozens of radio programs and podcasts worldwide, and we're honored to have him on here tonight. His 30-plus national and international lectures have included presentations at Harvard, Cambridge University, and Beijing University. And we can go on, but I'm going to go ahead and bring Dr. Bob on now. How are you?
Oh, hi. It's a pleasure to be with you again, Alan.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on again. It's been I don't know, I guess a couple of years since you've been on. And, I've always appreciated your grounded scientific approach to the paranormal. Obviously, on this show, we speculate a lot. So it'll be good to get your voice of what I would call reason within the realm of the supernatural. So can you tell us a little bit about Unseen Forces?
It's an attempt on my part. Whether or not I'm successful, who knows? That's for the reader to judge.
Oh, no, it's good. Yeah.
And it's trying to look at how science can possibly explain what we call paranormal, which eventually will be the normal or new normal, and what it means for us as individuals. So what does it mean in terms of this complex reality, whether or not this is the only reality, or are indeed some people, in a sense, having a peak experience, an extraordinary experience, call it the spiritual, natural, or mystical, whatever term we use, but they contend, as you well know, to pierce the veil and experience an alternate reality, and millions do claim this. The question is whether or not they're seeing a different world or seeing this world differently. And there is a debate on the issue. But I think the medical community, psychological community needs to certainly be more familiar and aware that so many people are having these kinds of experiences, either through a near-death experience or out-of-body experience, even through meditation or experimenting with DMT, ayahuasca, which is becoming popular, and not practical unless under very well controlled, very careful conditions.
Sure.
I'm not advocating that. But people do have mystical experiences that defy logical explanation. And in fact, Johns Hopkins University is doing a lot of research with the DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the active component of psilocybin and ayahuasca, and looking at it as it relates to near-death experiences and noting similarities in terms of the transformations that people experience, either through chemical agents like ayahuasca or DMT, or having a near-death experience or out-of-body experience, or meditative states, or types of altered states of consciousness induced through various means, but resulting in a type of similarity in terms of how it transforms the individual. And that's what's uniquely interesting. And I do focus on that, Alan, in my book, trying to apply meaning to it, if at all possible, from a scientific perspective, but also weaving in the subjective, what the individual is experiencing, because ultimately, what are we talking about? A type of inner experience that is beyond real to the person who goes through it. And they will contend with fierce determination. And I know you've had these individuals on your show. You've talked to them firsthand, know them, as I do, and many of us do, who are listening now have gone through that experience. I haven't. In fact, they know more than we do. But with fierce determination, they contend that they have pierced the veil, either through whatever modality, to the point where they have ego dissolution.
So is it fair to say another way to explain a peak experience is a mystical experience?
Sure. It does come down to semantics, but that can also be similar to the spiritual experience, the extraordinary experience, the magical experience. It's just something that causes you to pause more than ever before from any experience you've ever had. Yeah. That is so meaningful and profound that it changes you from that moment forward.
Yeah. So peak experience, and then there's sort of subcategories under that title, correct?
There's a lot of things that knock our socks off, like a game-winning home run in the bottom of the ninth in the seventh game of the World Series. But this goes way, way, way beyond that. And that's, as it may be hard to believe. That's what people contend. The question is, again, is it a neurobiologic event of the brain? Is it a brain glitch, an hallucinatory event, as some claim? Certainly, the medical community, to a large extent, scientific community, will take the materialistic 3D approach and ascribe it to some hallucinatory or psychotic, dissociative type of experience unique to the individual. And certainly nothing more than that as an indication of an altered state of consciousness that's allowing one to actually experience another reality. And this goes back to maybe what name comes to mind, William James, the so-called the person in charge of psychology, in a sense. He evolved it back in the early 1900s, and he I remember he ascribed, and many do in the scientific community, contend that the brain, I could vouch for this as well from my experience, the brain can actually impede one's ability to perceive true reality. That's a theory, but there's some evidence to support that. We know we can only sense the real energies within certain bandwidths that are limited in terms of the auditory and visual, and we know that energies exist beyond that. The question, of course, is whether or not there are other alternate realities as people contend. This is where quantum physics comes into play, and this is where the controversy begins to unfold. And we have to be very careful how to interpret the kinds of experiences that people are expressing wholeheartedly from all walks of life, passing all types of formal psychological tests, proving with beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are well-balanced individuals, not suffering from any schizophrenia or psychosis that would give rise to these kinds of strong, fiercely determined contentions that they did interact with their deceased relative and obtain information that they could have not have obtained accurately, which was later found to be true.
Well, right. And so, one of the categories you have is non-human entities, NHEs, and that covers a lot of different experiences. I mean, it could be an extraterrestrial, it could be what is termed an ultra-terrestrial, or a ghost. And or a fairy. And I wonder, the eyes are kind of an extension of the brain, right? But it's a tool for the brain. So you're saying that the brain could possibly, when someone says they see a ghost, but you don't catch it on camera, is that because the brain is somehow able to sense without the eyes and process into the visual cortex and make sense of that? And if so, how do you think that's even possible?
Well, there is some communication on, let's just say, invisible pathways. That's the basis of telepathy, or ESP, which is a real phenomenon, by the way. It's a subtle effect, but it's been proven in the laboratory. And we see evidence of it as well in many different experiments, as well as anecdotally that people have. But I think, though, that if we get to your question, but give it to me again. So it's.
Well, what is that process? Like what's happening up here that I can, or actually let's make a distinction early on, that there's the brain and then there's the mind, right? So which is picking up on extrasensory perception, and how is that happening?
Well, non-local communication is what we're talking about when there is extrasensory perception. And people who have many of these kinds of peak experiences contend that they are interacting with non-human entities that come in many shapes, forms, and sizes that have been handed down throughout time, that have been represented from the cave walls of 20,000 years ago through biblical times, folklore, etc. And the elves, the fairies, the other types of beings that have been described in various different ways may very well be present-day greys that people are currently describing, or the reptilians, or whatever they're saying. Mm-hmm. And the kind of evolutionary process that ufology has gone through, and it certainly has been, there is a historical evidential trail where it morphs in many different ways, shapes, and forms over time, and even through recent times, we see this change. I don't need to go into detail. I think many, if not most of your viewers are very familiar with this, but we see it from the airships of the 1890s to today's abductions and communications that these non-human entities seem to be having, that many people contend. And I'm not saying they definitely are. This is what some of the anecdotal evidence is presenting, and it's more frequent than the average person might think about that. But nevertheless, the question is whether or not they are indeed interacting with a type of entity, possibly and very likely more advanced than us, that has always been here on Earth, and we're the new kids on the block. That is not a unique idea. It's been kicked around, but evidence seems to point more and more to the fact that might very well be the angels of modern day era of lights in the sky. Mm-hmm. But that may certainly only be one of many other phenomena. Again, not a unique idea, because we do see a physical aspect of the phenomena as well as the non-physical. And we know Jacques Vallée talked about it, and Alan Hynek talked about it, and John Mack, certainly I ascribe to it, among many others, although not as many as we might think, whereby a physical craft might very well leave depressions in the ground, or a crop circle might appear that's so complex within a moment's notice. And that's also not given enough attention as it probably deserves, by the way, the crop circle phenomena. But it's so complex, I think most people prefer to leave that alone and like to look for
there's certainly not one phenomena, right? I mean, if you're opening the door to saying extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials or angels exist, you've kind of opened Pandora's box at that point, because then anything is on the table. And so if there is one other entity that's conscious besides humans out there, then why can't there be a multitude? Just a plethora of conscious beings that are in different forms relating to us.
Well, Alan, the spooky thing is that most, I should say more scientists than ever before are starting to come out of the closet and actually leaning in that direction and utilizing some of the controversial theories in quantum physics as rationale to support just that. Mm-hmm. And we're right on the cusp of that paradigm shift, where we've gone, of course, from Copernicus to Darwinism to now quantum physics, to looking at spatial temporal aspects of reality that seem to defy laws of Newtonian physics, which we now fall within, but are evolving into a new paradigm as we better understand the essence of our physical reality, better incorporating and proving many of the theories that are controversial, but seem to be coming to pass within quantum physics, like the law of entanglement and superposition, that help explain some of the paranormal phenomena we are discussing right here.
Well, I was just reading something about non-locality, spooky action at a distance, but at a larger molecular scale. And this was like a new study some kind of observation that came out recently. I'm sorry, Bob, I don't have the link, but it just popped into my mind as you mentioned that.
Well, it was an outcome within the past few weeks of the activity and research activity at the Large Hadron Collider, and they came up with a new discovery of the smallest unit of physical matter, and I forget the name of that muon. That's what it was, MUON, something like that. Again, what it is anybody's guess, but it seems to be something new and different. And as I keep discovering these ultra particles or essences, true essences of reality, they start revealing how much more enigmatic reality really is. And the question is, can we extrapolate from the micro cosmic kind of behavior, as bizarre as it is, at that micro level, that microscopic world of quantum physics, with photons, electrons, the building blocks of our physical universe are so bizarre in nature, where you can divide an electron, of course, separated by light years, and you turn one clockwise, the other separated one turns counterclockwise. We know that there's no temporal spatial distinction between these kinds of physical material. Now,
and this isn't theory. This is
no, that's proven. This old spooky action at its distance, which Einstein referred to it as, he did later on admit to the fact that does indeed exist, but he couldn't explain it. And that's the kind of paradigm we now live under, that Newtonian physics kind of paradigm, which cannot explain the kind of phenomena that millions of people have and will continue to experience, from the unidentified area of phenomenon to the near-death experience, and then some, as we all hear, as you discuss experiences with your guests, as unusual as they are. Much of that is starting to be explainable by our better understanding of the physical aspects of our reality. But it takes time. It'll take another 100 years before we get to a level of understanding, scratching the surface as we are now with stone knives.
But that's fun, though, isn't it? Isn't it fun scratching at the surface?
Well, yes, it is stimulating. Yeah. Many of us so-called truth seekers, and most are listening to it. We enjoy it. And it is intellectually stimulating, and it does provide meaning in our lives, and that's beautiful. Yeah. We have to just be careful separating the fact from the fiction, that so-called sense from the nonsense, and that is what's hard to do.
Right, yeah. And we cover it all here on Paranormal Now, and that's why it's important to have someone like you, Bob, come on here and really help support some of these theories with good science. But could we possibly understand the nature of reality if we don't even understand our own minds? I mean, how far down and how deep can we contemplate without even understanding the nature of our reality?
We have to be so careful in making any conclusion. In fact, we have to say up front that we cannot, and we be very premature and too egotistical in saying that we have the answer, that there is a conclusion to whatever we're saying, because there isn't, and nobody should contend that they have the answer.
So do you think, without saying for a fact, do you think there's a soul?
I say there is evidence that is highly suggestive of. That is covering my you know what. It's like I'm a physician about ready to do surgery on you. I'm going to have you sign 47 different pages of material so that I'm covered, and it's an easy cop out. But you have to say that. I will be so bold as to say, however, that there is indeed, and it is easier to say, that there, without question, is something is highly significant. Many things are highly significant that is occurring, that is so complex in nature that if we were given the answer to what true reality is, we couldn't understand it. And we probably shouldn't be able to hear it because may very well be too revealing and upset our belief system. You never know. It could be too risky. And the parties that be, they don't know. I doubt that they do, but they're curious enough to try to find out, just like us. But I don't think the government, the CIA, whoever you want to talk about, in some decompartmentalized organization buried somewhere underground or in some cave,
has the answers.
And you think they're in the know. I don't think they're in the know. They may know a little bit more of the surface. They don't know the true essence of the phenomena, because if they did, they'd have to be allowed to know it by that intelligence, which has to be vastly superior. I would say, if I had to guess and not making a conclusion, going more with the anecdotal evidence I see, is what most people will try to derive based on the information we have. We don't need the science to tell us what the answers are. We know as much as science does. In fact, science can't explain it under the umbrella of Newtonian physics. That's why we have to better incorporate a type of paradigm that takes much more seriously one's subjective impression, one's experience, the essence, the believability of their experience, and what it did to them behaviorally. How did it transform them? Because they say that it made them more humane. Now, if it makes them more humane, that to me is an aspect of reality that we have to take much more seriously. So something like that to provoke or facilitate is quite significant.
But isn't that the point? Because you said it's too risky. What do you mean by too risky? Like our brains can't handle it?
It's hard to say. It could make people who are highly religious question their faith and who and what is real or true. It could be so diametrically opposed to their belief system that it could be too emotionally upsetting to them and unfair, not fair for them or appropriate for them to handle. It could be emotionally traumatic for a large subsector of the population. It depends, of course, on what that information is, and we can only speculate. But it may be too risky in that regard, and it's hard to know. It's like
it would create like a schism, or.
There have been formal organizations and investigations looking at just this, how society would react if we were visited by extraterrestrials, or if something like this was actually revealed to the public at large, something so extraordinary as this, something that is inconceivable, something in effect that we're talking about. We're talking about really the overarching issue of what? Of the possibility that, and you alluded to this, that of the mind or some aspect of consciousness being distinctly different than the brain. And that may very well be the ultimate question that we're addressing here. Is it not, when people are saying they're having a near-death experience or having a type of altered state of consciousness where time and space is changed, where there's no time, there's no space. There's that sensation, as people declare, as we know, as listeners to your shows in particular, and a few others, that there is the essence and connection of love with the universe, with deceased relatives, with other beings that they contend to interact with. Now, what is that all about? And then you combine, however, similar other types of investigations, many of which involve those who are on death's door, but who are lucid. The after-death communications, whereby work done by Dr. Christopher Kerr up in Buffalo, among many others, have looked at how individuals, whereby it's much more often than not where the dying will say that they were visited by the angels with their arms outstretched, or deceased relatives walking on one side and the deceased friends walking on the other side, touching their arm. 3 days later, they die. And they received great comfort, whether or not it's delusional, hallucinatory, a representative, symptomatic of a metabolically deprived, dying brain. Well, I hope my brain is in that same condition if and when my time comes. Let it be a delusion. Maybe that is the way that the body deals with death. It would be nice if that's built into our system innately, like a survival mechanism, among other many bodily kinds of functions and emotional types of regulation that we all experience. And maybe there is an innate experience when we are at death's door that cushions that traumatic transition that many would feel, certainly.
So in a sense, we're not going out like a chicken with its head cut off, right? It's easing the passing, whether it's quick or slow.
You're based on what I've seen in the evidence. It clearly points in that direction. But here again, we're only looking at the anecdotal evidence as well as the evidence of hospice workers and those who take care of the dying, physicians. And there have been thousands of physicians and health workers, nurses of the dying in hospice care and elsewhere, and they contend that it is much more common than not for that to be the case, where there is some type of interaction with the deceased, either very vivid dreams where they believe it to be as real as everyday waking experience. And it's not a lucid dream. It's beyond that, where we have very real dreams. We all have had that. This is where we have to better understand the validity of the essence of one's subjective experience and consider whether or not that should be incorporated in a new scientific paradigm, because these individuals say that it is real. That even though it did appear in a dream, it was distinctly different than a dream. Just like the people who say they have a near-death experience. Right. What they experienced was not dreamlike in any way of their experience. It was distinctly different because it was just like the world is to you right now. That real. And that's the impression that they're left with. They say to themselves, what I just went through was real. Now, we can't understand that, at least those that have not had that experience. And, if that is delusional, if that is brain-based, give me it.
Well,
because it helps them. It makes them more humane.
And it does. It seems to help people kind of see through the veil. And I'm using that very broadly, right? Seeing into the matrix. But the thing is that what I find... people that I've spoken to who had these kind of experiences, or whether it's a psychedelic experience, that they start to see through a lot of the world's BS, right? Things that are going on in society. But there's that aspect, and you talk about it in the book, of this idea that we're all one, right? This like love, grand connection. And so those people, even if they see what's wrong with the society, they don't come at it with a sense of anger and frustration and they get, driven by vitriol and irrational thinking, because they're grounded with the idea that whoever is behind this conspiracy or that conspiracy, whatever it is, we're all kind of in this together. And the approach to making the world a better place is through a sense of empathy and love and trying to get people to understand, of course, but that's different than someone who gets into a more paranoid kind of a state. And you said that, these PE experiences, they might be too overwhelming, but for someone who's religious, but I would argue that that's actually the opposite case, because you actually do give a good example in the book of a woman who had a hard time having a conversation with her husband, who was a preacher, I think, and she just said, "I can't do this anymore. Like, everything you're saying, it's not true, because I've been to the other side, and I've seen, other parts of the nature of reality, and but but she still had a sense of love for him and her family. And do you know, it wasn't the sense of
I understand what you mean, and these individuals who do see the other side, I do advocate for it, because it does make them more humane. The downside is that the people who live with them and know them, they say that they don't know the person anymore since the NDE or since their experience with whatever being that they claim to have interacted with, etc., or a UAP experience.
Right,
What transformed them? I don't know the person anymore.
Right.
It does lead to those kinds of personal, domestic issues, social issues. But yeah, does society benefit overall and evolve in a positive direction? It seems that will likely be the case. Yes, indeed, because these people do become more compassionate, empathetic, more loving. Yes, there is a unitive experience, that so-called ego dissolution that Maslow had talked about, and indeed, it's a rough time. It could provoke a spiritual emergency, many questions of why me, who am I, etc. But in the long run, this is part of the evolution of either the brain and or consciousness, the state of affairs with our psyche, with humanity. And of course it has a long way to go. And I think here we're on that kind of cusp. We're not going to obviously see much in this lifetime for us, but it'll be again another 100 years where we start to take much more seriously with believability and validity that because people are so transformed the way that you beautifully express. Yes, indeed. That they can handle, although it is difficult, certainly.
Well, it seems like it's actually more difficult on the people who don't experience it rather than the people who have had the experience.
It's a painful learning lesson because they do have this spiritual emergency indeed, and we don't have the right kinds of resources in the medical community, psychological community to adequately deal with them. And we have a crisis with them right now, and they contend after their kind of peak experience or extraordinary experience that it changed them in such a personal and philosophical way that was so profound and to the core of their being that they are left in a sense with a PTSD, of course, and their coffee is going to taste very differently the next morning, but they believe that they now sense an alternate aspect of reality that is real, and it makes them how can not question their current existence and who they am and the essence and meaning and purpose of their life and what should they do with it, because many change their professional obligations and careers as a result.
Yeah. If I see a being, is that considered a peak experience or is that something separate?
Well, it depends. And I don't know for sure. That is something that research has to provide for us, because people are contending so many different things. And there are apparently different kinds of messages that they receive because of the different beings that they interact with. Yeah. And it seems that it runs the whole spectrum. And we know so little about that. But whatever it is, it does seem to be consistent among people. And the question, of course, is why? And you talked about it earlier as well. The fact that it positively changes them as opposed to making them have delusions or fear or negative emotions that's chronic in nature. That is more representative of an aberrant behavior or a mental illness, whereby these individuals talk of only good, of joy, of love, not fear, evil, hate, of things, in other words, that clearly distinguish well-being from those that are not. So based on what they say, they behave more normally than the average individual, more humanely. And that's why many who have this near-death experience or other types of peak experiences benefit in that regard. And
what about laughter for other peak experiencers? Because from my own experience on psychedelics, when I've not had a bad trip, you even then you come out of it and part of that experience is laughing, because you just see the absurdity in so much that is around you. And it's this kind of a release. It's like, oh my God, I've been hung up on this, or I've been hung up on that. Like, this is so sick. Why are they behaving that way? What are they wasting their energy on? Now, you have that experience, and it may last for a while. For some people, it'll last for 5 years, and they retain that growth. Some remember it and retain parts of that, as personal growth. But what about these other near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences? Do they have that kind of lighter, more humorous experience as well?
One thing that we do know is that they contend that their life is so dramatically different than ever before, to the point where their viewpoints on death and family and material matters and spirituality, or organized religion, monetary values, are all distinctly different. And that's why those that know the person very well do say the person is a lot more normal in many ways, and more humane, and characteristically different in terms of their personal, again, philosophical attributes. The question is, they are so different that lighter as it may be, laughter as it may be, and not only that, they become so much more loving as a human being towards others. Yeah. Lighter in that respect, to the extreme where their spouse becomes jealous, or they feel it's too much in that way. But they don't mean it that way. They just are more loving, interconnected with human beings, but express it much more so.
Sure. Is that any different than just someone having personal growth?
Here again, it comes down to what even our ancestors used to say about this mystical experiences, as they described it in folklore, the so-called unitive experience, which we also call now the ego dissolution aspect to it, where those that believe that they are the center of the world feel just the opposite after these kinds of experiences. Yeah. They are now put in their place, and that is a 360 to the point where it becomes quite obvious to those who know that person. Yeah. And it seems to be chronic, long-lasting in nature. And I talk to them, and they say ever since then, when they had the near-death experience, for instance, 35 years ago, I do not fear death at all. In fact, I welcome it, as they say.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going back home, and they believe it.
Yeah, I can speak from experience. I think that the healthiest relationship to help prevent that sort of splitting, because one person might have to go through an evolution at this point in time, another goes through an evolution at this point in time. And for a couple to remain together and continue to love each other, you kind of have to have your hand out to the other person. So that way, when one's going through a growth and the other one's going through a period of growth, you can kind of either you wait for the other one, or you more like reaching your hand out, right? And you listen to each other, and you try to adapt and learn from the other person's growth. I think if those who had those near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences came back into a relationship where that was the case, then maybe they wouldn't have that kind of schism, right? And are there any instances that you can recall where someone came back and the person they were with was like, "Oh my gosh, well, tell me more,"
No, I don't. I don't know enough personal experiences, but they do share many similar characteristics, and they share many similar characteristics not only among each other, but also with those who have the experience with psychedelics as well. Even Johns Hopkins University just completed a study whereby they administered DMT, again, as I mentioned earlier, the active ingredient of psilocybin, to willing volunteers. Approximately 3/4 of them who were not believers in any supreme being, a deity, before their DMT experience became believers in a supreme being. And the numbers were so pronounced that you talk about transformative aspects of altered states of consciousness, and it appears it's not only through natural means via a near-death experience, which happens, by the way, to 200,000 Americans annually, and certainly millions worldwide, who have these types of similar experiences. So we're talking about something that's rather common, and more so, and those numbers likely underestimate the true actual incidence statistic for fear of even talking about it. But nevertheless, of that negative cultural connotation that has. I would say that we're talking about different modalities creating, in a sense, a similar kind of outcome. And when we better understand the essence of true reality, in other words, this not being the only one, and that there is life after death especially, it puts a new twist on life. It's almost as if there's a reflexive kind of feeling that comes with that knowledge. And people who have a faith-based belief, many of them do have that reflexive belief in life after death, and to the point where they don't fear death anymore. Many of us who don't have to learn it the hard way, maybe through an NDE. But the question is more than that. The question is, are these kinds of experience reflective of a valid experience that, while it is real to the individual, does that necessarily prove that there is an alternate reality, that there are other kinds of beings that are interacting with us, possibly exerting influence on us, possibly representing aspects of the unidentified area phenomena that millions of people contend is real?
Well, I just want to say I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking, we discussed this before we went on the air a little bit, the UAP phenomena, the USS Omaha video that was released yesterday. Ever since 2017, with the ATIP program publicizing these videos, it seems that culture is more primed. And so do you think that there is a priming going on, maybe not intentionally, but to help human beings, help their minds be more fertile and prepared for some other modality, like you say, perhaps beyond a nuts and bolts craft, but something more?
Well, you don't know for sure. I think at one level our government is ready to be more responsive to the outcries of their constituents and start to ask some questions. But it's just a revolving door. We've been down this same path back in the 60s with Project Blue Book and UN hearings, and we're just going full circle. It's political, and it's waking some people up, and I'm glad it's being done without question. But it's not doing anything for those of us who know something about the field. And we're not going to get any answers through these kinds of formal political outcries. But we do, of course, need more multidisciplinary investigations. Maybe there is some physical evidence that's being analyzed as we speak. So says Jacques Vallée in his very recent contentions. But that certainly remains to be seen. But nevertheless, there is some spoon feeding going on. The question is there spoon feeding, but by also non-human entities, not only by maybe our governmental officials? And some people are contending that may also be at play going on here. We do suspect, however, that since nuclear weapons came on the scene, as we all are well aware of the incidents from with our Minutemen rockets back in the 60s at Malmstrom Air Force Base and elsewhere, also in Russia at the same time. The fact that these missiles were deactivated and then reactivated in a uniform fashion just boggles the minds of the experts. And I bow to them like I bow to a select few of people within our field who are sincere and seem to have a good insight into the phenomenon. And when loops came on the scene, I think the powers that be, whoever they may be, non-earthly in nature, possibly, we're saying that's enough. You're crossing a line here, and if you guys can mess around with yourselves, and if you want to beat yourselves up, go right ahead. It's free will indeed, but when you start crossing the line, maybe with fission material and such, that's disturbing our property too. And we've been around here a lot longer than you, Homo sapiens. It's fun to think about this. And you mentioned that earlier. We could be way off base here. And I'm not saying that is the case at all. But when you're having a few beers with your friends, sometimes it's stimulating to think of that. And, you'd be surprised how there may be some hidden elements of truth there. Because there's no other explanation that provides any degree of meaning to the surreal nature of the phenomenon that we only address with the most primitive of scientific principles. And Newtonian physics, again, certainly doesn't apply. So we have inadequate data to go by to make any firm conclusion.
Well, instead of a few beers, for me, it's coffee 24/7. So I'm always in that state of mind. I'm always primed and ready for all things. But I do think that, like you've seen it with the pandemic or any situation where you kind of need people to come together, you have to get the collective consciousness to be on the same page, right? So maybe you're right. Maybe it's just another, Project Sign or Blue Book. But I would like to think that, including Project Sign and Blue Book, through the decades, collectively we have been primed, whether it's through Hollywood and what have you, so that if there is that official first contact where this consciousness reaches out to us, not our government, I doubt it's going to happen like that, but that consciousness comes and says, hey, we're here. We have to be ready collectively, right? But I don't know how you do that on planet Earth with all these different countries and religions and borders and political systems.
Yeah, I don't think we can right now. I think we're getting better prepared for it. It wouldn't surprise me after what we've just gone through as a society, as nations on this planet at such unique times. We've all accelerated the aging process as a result, and we'll all suffer the consequences in one way or another down the road as the pieces are picked up and our lives are restored back to near normal, or whatever that might be. It's kind of strange that we're talking about the non-normal, or paranormal. I think we've just experienced the paranormal. Our worst nightmare came true. Certainly for virologists at the very beginning, they couldn't believe what was happening because they knew the outcomes at the very beginning. And it was more surreal to them, I think, until we experienced it. But nevertheless, we're still going through it. It's not over, obviously. But one thing at a time, my gosh, and I think people now, especially with the Senate Intelligence Report at hand in June, led by Marco Rubio, and I give some of the politicians credit for at least looking into this phenomenon called the UAP, even though we've been down the road before. Yeah, it's good to revisit it, to get the collective consciousness together on a matter of something that's extraordinarily important. It seems like the population is divided on many issues, one of them, too, being the UAP. Maybe half the population cares deeply about what's going on with that type of phenomena, what it means, the implications of it. Is it people from Mars, or is it another dimensional type of intelligence? People are starting to ask these kinds of questions, especially when people like you, the good, credible professionals like yourself, and only a few select others in my book, are providing the kinds of insight, unique guests that are presenting the appropriate information to the public, helping us as consumers decipher as best as possible, because there's such nonsense out there, and you wonder who and what to believe, and so we're at the mercy of that. And what the only thing I could say, however, with confidence, is that people need to be aware that we all make mistakes of making errors in inductive reasoning, where we actually believe things that are only consistent with what we regard as true. And that's a problem we all fall into. It is, in other words, very difficult to be objective all the time.
Sure. Yeah.
And that has to be, we know that, all of us,
Yeah.
but we forget it. And we fall into that trap much more often than we think.
Well, I'm encouraged by, I don't know if you read Avi Loeb's book, Extraterrestrial, but he's really pushing the scientific community. And I saw a follow-up article like a couple weeks later. I think I want to say Newsweek. I'm not sure, but it kind of iterating what he was saying. And it's that if you want the public to trust the scientific community, then you have to be honest about your flaws. You have to be honest that you have opinions and that it's okay. And that science is a process. There's this kind of this mindset that you have to present a final be all end all factual conclusion to the public. And then that's it, right? Otherwise they're never going to trust you if you waver. And the opposite is actually true. Humans would tend to trust you more if you were a little more transparent, instead of it looks like you're kind of hiding something, right? Otherwise.
I have great respect for Dr. Loeb. Tremendous respect. He's courageous. And in his steadfast belief, again, that Oumuamua was not a comet or a meteor, that it was of intelligent design and on a mission of some type. He goes into detail and complex papers. I attempted to read them. I can't understand them. I'm not an astrophysicist, but using complex formulas, math, among other kinds of evidence that, look, he's an astrophysicist from Harvard. I'm going to listen to him. It doesn't mean he's right. Let's not, let's be objective.
Exactly.
Because there are other scientists in that field and related fields that do still contend that he could be wrong. And so let's say, even though he has that name and title, let's see it be duplicated. Let's see if there are others similar to it. Something to note, without question, could be suggestive of. And let's go so far as to say that. And I don't think he's saying definitely. I think we have to be courageous enough to suspect the possibility that this is an alternative possibility, unless it's something that we simply do not understand, of foreign explainable art.
Well, Michio Kaku has been pretty open about, hey, you don't know. Maybe we're being visited right now. We just can't see them. I mean, those types of words have come out of his mouth, which I find very encouraging. But it seems to me that the larger public isn't always exposed to these conversations. And so, we keep trying to do different podcasts and different streams. There's mainstream, alternative, whatever. But there's still a lot of people out there who haven't heard that yet. If you stop somebody on the street and ask them if you think aliens exist, they'll go, "What? Are you crazy?" That's a bunch of woo-woo. But it is changing. It is changing, like just little by little, ticking away. Something that came to mind too, a documentary that my wife and I did called Born Equal. We interviewed Reverend Dr. Scopper here in New York. And she described Jesus as a boundary dissolving rebel. And I thought like that's one of the best expressions of what he represents. And it seems to me like that's kind of what happens with people who have these peak experiences, right? They come back and it's about boundary dissolution, and they have something to share with you. They have a story. And again, love is at the center of all that. So is this conversation about love just us projecting onto these experiences, or do you really think there's some kind of substrate in the universe that is otherwise known as love?
Yeah, it seems John Lennon had it right. He nailed it. Love's the answer. That's what so many say consistently. And they say it in a fashion that language does not convey adequately, of course, but they all try to get at it. We don't have the right research tools to understand what people are trying to get at. That's the problem with language itself. But it is so deep in intensity that the feeling of love that they try to convey using words, again, that doesn't convey it. Yeah. But it's the kind of love that one woman who says she had in her NDE, she felt the love of light, of a supreme being of some type, of some power. And she said, it's like the feeling of being given your first newborn for the first time in your arms, magnify that by 1,000,000 times. That's the kind of love you feel. Yeah. When you have a near-death experience, when you feel that light. It's what other people say. They try to get at that. What word is that? You can't do it. It's not Newtonian physics. You can't prove that.
Let's leave it there, Bob. We are at the end of the hour. Thank you. So I went by super fast. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been too long, and hope we get to do it again soon. If you could leave us with just one thought or one observation, what would that be?
There's definitely something going on, something so profound that I think we'll eventually get the answer. But don't fear it. Everything is good. Everything's good.
All right. So everyone out there, please go to bobdavisspeaks.com. That's bobdavisspeaks.com and get his book, Unseen Forces. Thank you for your brilliance, Bob. I appreciate it. And hang in, everyone, for the second hour. Katherine Chiljan is joining us. And yeah, the mystery behind Shakespeare. Oh, you didn't hear about it? Yeah, it's real. He's not who you think he is, or so Katherine believes. And it goes so much deeper. So to hang in there and explore the other side of this Paranormal Now show, please stay with us in the chat. Put your comments in the comments sections. I will keep my eye on them if you have any questions. Again, the lines will not be open in the last 30 minutes. So on the other side, all your comments I'll be watching on Facebook, YouTube, or even Periscope if you're hanging out on Periscope, which on occasion we get someone jumping in here as well. All right, we'll see you on the flip side. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now. Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is going to be a really fun second hour. I'm really excited to speak with Katherine Chiljan, and we're talking about her book, Shakespeare Suppressed. There's a lot going on in history that we are not taught in schools. I think that many of us know that, and Katherine tonight is going to share and expose the past. Katherine is an independent scholar who has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 30 years. She has debated the topic with English professors at the Smithsonian Institution and at the Mechanics Institute Library in San Francisco. She has written several articles for Shakespeare Oxford Newsletter and served as its editor for 2 years. She is currently on the Research Grant Committee for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Welcome, Katherine. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for taking on the greatest lie in literature.
Yes, I'm actually really excited about this. Look, Shakespeare has brought so much to our lives, even the paranormal, right? I mean, some of the greatest eerie tales of all time come from Shakespeare. And his impact on culture, at least in the Western culture, Europe, in particular, is profound. And I have to ask you, what drew you to Shakespeare in the first place? Where did you first, sink your teeth in?
Well, I always was interested in literature since a teenager, and I was reading a list that my English teacher gave me of all the great classics. So I wanted to be aware of them all, including Shakespeare. And actually, it was in my 10th grade English class that when we were reading Romeo and Juliet, she mentioned, or maybe it was Julius Caesar, she mentions that some people think that Christopher Marlowe was Shakespeare.
That's the first thing that came to my mind. Yeah.
That's all she said. She didn't say anything else, but that stuck in my brain. And then several years later, I saw on TV, in the TV guide, that there was a debate between people on the authorship question, a Shakespeare professor versus someone who supported a different candidate. And I was totally unbiased. I was recently graduated as a history major from UCLA, and I would watch it. And all I saw was the man who was defending a different candidate was making point after point, whereas the Shakespeare professor couldn't even defend his own man, and all he could do was cast aspersions on the gentleman who was Charlton Ogden, who wrote the book The Mysterious William Shakespeare, and that had just come out. And so, of course, I read that, and that was it. I was hooked. I just wanted to tell everybody about it because Shakespeare is so important to humanity. So many works of art have been, based on a Shakespeare play or poem. And the question is, who do people think Shakespeare actually is? Well, the orthodox story is he was someone with humble origins, born in the small town of Stratford on Avon. Mm-hmm. And somehow he got interested in the theater, worked as an actor, and then somehow made the transition to writing plays. And he was a success. And so he supposedly he made money. And then a few decades later, he retired and went back home, and nothing was ever heard from him again.
Could you actually make money, producing plays or writing plays?
I think you would be paid a few pounds, or maybe as much as £6 if you were a really good writer, and that was a lot back then. But I don't think you could really make a lot. It would make you rich.
Right, and he wasn't rich, right?
Well, he was rich enough to buy the second biggest home in Stratford on Avon. So he did in the end make money.
Okay.
But this is the kind of the mythology that we're talking about. If we look at this man from Stratford, we call him the Stratford Man. He was a real person, but there is no lifetime evidence that he wrote plays or poems or wrote anything at all. We don't have anything in his handwriting. Yes.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was going to say, for an actor involved in theater, why wouldn't he share that?
Why wouldn't he share what?
That he wrote, if indeed he was Shakespeare.
Well, right. I mean, the point is we don't have any literary paper trail with the guy.
Yeah.
Also, if you look at his past, there is no record of him being educated. They all say that he went to the local grammar school, which is possible, but those records don't survive for that time frame. If you look at what the great author knew, his incredible knowledge, it's not something that you would get from a few years in Stratford on Avon Grammar School. Yeah. He knew things like Italian, French, rhetoric, ancient Greek, a deep understanding of Latin. He knew the Bible. He knew medicine. He knew the law. That was something that really interested Mark Twain.
Yeah,
he just couldn't understand. Where did this guy with humble origins and no education? How did he know about the law so well? So, these type of topics are taught at university level. As far as law school, there were law schools there, and these enrollment records have survived in law schools and universities, and there's no William Shakespeare in it.
Yeah.
And,
So this, Jesus of Nazareth comes up once again, but a couple of episodes back, we were talking about how, Jesus, was far too educated to just be a simple carpenter, right? He was very worldly. He brought philosophies that were novel, to the region at the time, and there is a suspicion that there's more to his story. He must have traveled. He must have experienced. He must have studied under others, and it sounds similar with Shakespeare, right? This couldn't just be some average, whether he's smart or not, an average person. His experience must have been above average, his exposure to knowledge. And then obviously through his writings, it's his insight into human nature and his ability to express that. Forget what he may have been able to study. He was basically a genius. The breadth of his work is so profound. I have to ask you before we move on, of all the works, what is your favorite of Shakespeare's?
I would say it would be Hamlet and the sonnets. The sonnets were his personal poems, writing about, most of them are in the first person. So he is talking about himself and the people he loved. And, you get true insight about him. Yeah. And he does make these revelations, in them too, that he was a nobleman, if you really look at them. Like, for example, one sonnet, he says, "Methinks no face as gracious is as mine," something like that. Now, having a gracious face was something like he would describe for kings and queens. Grace, that was a term for nobility and kings. So he was, describing himself really as a nobleman. I mean, that's just one instance. There are a few others.
Right. Now, but if you're hiding behind a pen name, can you just kind of say whatever you want about yourself, even if it's not necessarily true?
Yeah, of course. And that was one of the reasons why he wrote anonymously or with a pen name. And that pen name was William Shakespeare, as in spear shaking, like jousting. About half the time that the word William Shakespeare was in print, it had a hyphen between shake and spear, which was indicative of a made-up name. So this was really a pen name. Now, the problem is there was somebody who was born with that name, William Shakespeare, right? And that was actually, if you look at how his name was spelled phonetically in legal documents, that's the way it was pronounced. Shakespeare.
Shakespeare.
Shaxpear, Shakspear, William Shakespeare. It was never hyphenated like the great author's name was. It was, there's a total disconnect between these two people. The problem is that the Stratford Man did get involved with the theater. And that's how this whole thing got so messy. There were really two William Shakespeares at the same time, which is not unusual. There were two people named John Davies who were poets that to this day, their works they're not sure which is which as far as their works.
Yeah, Shakespeare's work was celebrated, the sonnets even, in his time. So if you are that writer, why don't you capitalize on that? Why don't you use that? I guess the argument would be that he critiques the status quo. He critiques the socio dynamic and gender roles and like he's challenging powerful people directly.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right. So I mean that would be one reason to stay in the shadows. But it seems to me you would have to be someone of great means and able to keep that cover up going, even posthumously.
Yes. And that's why I think that this was a wealthy nobleman who had a penchant for writing. And I think that the works were originally written for Queen Elizabeth I and her courtiers. And, she didn't go to a theater, right? The theater came to her in her palaces and places, and she saw private performances. And we actually have some of these records of the plays that she saw with some indication of their title or what they were about. And one in particular was in 1577, and it was called The History of Error. And that corresponds very closely to Shakespeare's comedy, The Comedy of Errors, right? Yeah. But 1577 is a problem for the Shakespeare professor. He would say, no, the Stratford Man was like 13 years old at that time. It could not have been Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. This had to have been another play called The History of Error. So that's what's going on when you have the wrong author.
Why is
the wrong timeline?
Why is it so important for scholars to get stuck with the Stratford Man? Why do they care so much that has to be him?
I think the myth, the lie was repeated so long that maybe they just think it's part of reality, and and there's no need to question it. But really, if they knew the true biography of their own man, they would see that so much is missing, and that all the evidence for the Stratford Man is posthumous. After he died, nothing exists connecting him to education or writing when he was alive.
So then what about these pictures that we're familiar with?
Yes.
Who is this?
Yes, that's that famous picture of an engraving of supposedly William Shakespeare. And that appeared in 1623. This is the first image we have. And it was in the opening of a book of Shakespeare plays. Today we call it the First Folio. And it contained 36 Shakespeare plays. It was the greatest event, really, in literature. Because at that time, 20 Shakespeare plays had never seen print. So before, about 17 had been printed. So if it weren't for this book, we would only have 17 Shakespeare plays instead of 40.
How does that work? So Shakespeare writes a play, the Globe or whomever puts it on, and then do they not have scripts? Is there one copy that they're all sharing? How does that disappear? And then the copies of those plays when they're performed, is there somebody in the audience writing that down?
Well, there's a lot going on with the text. If you look at the very earliest printed editions of the Shakespeare plays, they're in mostly so-so to terrible condition. And the reason is because the great author was not giving him his originals. The real author did not want his works published in his lifetime. It would have been déclassé for the world to know that this nobleman, who he really was writing plays and poetry. And to publish them was very, there was a social code against it. It's just something you don't do. Sure. After you die, however, it would be a different story. But yes, the text, the condition of the text is terrible because the author didn't give us the originals. In fact, I would say we have never really read the real Shakespeare plays. We've yet to do that. We have to find them one day. And that's the terrible thing. There is not one play manuscript or one page of a play manuscript that has survived. So, when you consider he wrote about 40 plus plays and so many sonnets and long poems, to me, that says they were all collected and put somewhere. Where that is, I don't know.
Yeah, because if they're printing, then they're using something, right, as a reference to print these plays.
Yes, and like you were mentioning, I think there were people bootlegging them. They had people in the audience taking stenography of the lines, and then printers paid them and they printed it. but of course, they're in terrible condition. They have wrong words. There's confused lines. One character will have 3 different names. There's missing passages. So compared to other editions. Yeah. So to me, that tells you we didn't get the great author's originals. We got bootleg versions for the most part.
Wow. So if we try to imagine Shakespeare's writing these the original copies of his play, right? When he's finished with it, what does he do with it?
Well, I think that when he was entertaining the Queen, he gave his actors, their parts, and they performed them. And I think that these parts may have also stayed within the acting company or transferred to other acting companies. So I think that's how we have some decent ones. But I don't know if he handed them the whole play. We don't know. Very few play manuscripts of the period have survived.
Well, how would a normal troupe do this then? Christopher Marlowe, writes a play. What happens after he finishes?
Well, one of Marlowe's biggest producers was the actor Edward Allen, and he was a superstar. And he would probably pay Marlowe, him or his partner, who was his father-in-law, Philip Henslowe. I don't know exactly, the process, but the point is we don't have any Shakespeare play manuscripts.
So, but in theory, something was written down, right? I mean, he had to write this out somehow. Somehow the actors got their lines. And so why the cover up, right? Why go to such lengths, even if you're covering up your name and who you are, your true identity? It seems like there's this extra effort to even kind of remove plays from history so that no one finds them. This is so bizarre.
Well, in his lifetime, he didn't want it to be known,
right?
Okay? Yeah. Because of his very high social status. After his death, it would have been okay. Like, for example, Philip Sidney, he wrote the Arcadia, but he was a courtier. He was, from a noble family or had noble relatives. He did not print with his own name in his lifetime. But after he died, his own sister, who was a countess, printed his plays, not his plays, his Arcadia, which is a fiction. She printed it herself. So there was no stigma attached at that point. So what I have come up with is that there was a cover-up involved. There was a hoax involved. They didn't want the great author to be known, his true name, because the works revealed things. They revealed things about powerful people. They revealed things about the succession, which, it gets very political. So I think that after both the real author, who I believe was the Earl of Oxford, and the Stratford Man, when they had both died, they fixed it with publishing all of his plays where that image came from. And the opening pages thereafter. There's 16 prefatory pages. And on one page, Ben Jonson writes a poem to Shakespeare, and he calls Shakespeare Sweet Swan of Avon, probably a phrase you've heard of. Okay. Then you turn a few more pages, and then there's another writer writing a poem to Shakespeare, and he refers to Shakespeare's Stratford Monument. So on one page you have Avon, one page you have Stratford. It became assumed that the great author came from Stratford-on-Avon, which is where the Stratford Man came from, William Shakespeare. So that was it. From that point onward, the world looked at Stratford-on-Avon for the great author.
Yeah. Based on just that evidence. I mean, which is something.
Posthumous evidence, yes.
Right. It's something, but it's not entirely substantial.
No, because that's, it was ambiguous evidence. But there was a Stratford monument. There was a monument to William Shakespeare in the Stratford-on-Avon Church. Yes, there you go. That's it. That is one of the earliest pictures of it. Now, if you have that one, that's today's monument. And if by chance you can put them side by side, you can see that there was dramatic changes. I mean, the face is totally different. Today's face
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, today's face, the gentleman has an upturned mustache and a goatee. The first image of the monument, he has a drooping mustache. It's a little hard to tell, and a full beard. In this early version, he's holding a sack of some sort. In the other version, today's version, his hand is resting on a pillow with a piece of paper and a pen. Mm-hmm. Now, why isn't there a piece of paper and pen in this early engraving?
In the original, right?
Exactly.
Well, that is interesting. So, who is Shakespeare? Who do you think is Shakespeare?
I think he is Edward de Vere, and his title was Earl of Oxford. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford, so he had one of the highest titles in the land. When most earls, were the second Earl or the first Earl, newly created. He was the 17th. So his family, there were 500 years of history with the Earls of Oxford. So he was a great man that, he wanted to protect his family name, but he also had this incredible passion to write. And he had a comedic strain. He was known as best in comedy in his own day. He had a great reputation as a writer, as a poet and a playwright, and yet none of his plays survived. That is with his own name on it, you see.
I see. So there's documentation of him being entertaining, being funny, having written some things, but those things don't exist either.
Right. But he also was deeply involved in the theater. He owned acting companies. He acted before the Queen herself. We have a record of that. So he was into it very much. Huh. And interestingly, he received a £1,000 annuity from Queen Elizabeth. And she was notoriously stingy. So, £1,000 a year was a great deal of money. It was maybe close to $1 million. So and there was no accounting for why he got it, but he got it, right? And some of us in our Oxfordian movement believe that he was paid to put on these wonderful history plays and other plays that, made people feel proud to be English, especially when you had the threat of Spain, which was the world power back then. They were threatening them with, taking some sort of attack. And sure enough, it happened in 1588 when the Armada came. But, England fortunately beat them out,
Yeah.
So it may have had something to do with the Earl of Oxford and his plays.
Now, of all the images representing Shakespeare, does the Earl of Oxford image look like them at all to your eyes, or
look like
to the other images that we know? Like there's various different paintings of of whoever Shakespeare is supposed to have been.
Right. Right.
And then when you compare that to the Earl of Oxford, are there any similarities in your mind? Or
no, those are different men. The last one,
this is very different, right?
Sir Thomas Overby. Yeah. Oh, that one. Yeah, that's an unidentified man. They don't know 100% if this is Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. It's a very different nose too.
This is interesting because this really shows somebody, who's titled, and actually it resembles another picture of Sir Thomas Overbury. So there's been about 100 candidates put forward, but only the Earl of Oxford. His life he had the education. I mean, he went to Cambridge, he went to Oxford, he went to law school. He took a grand tour of Europe. I mean, he had tutors when he was a child. I mean, when he went to Cambridge, he was 8 years old. So he was extremely educated. He had a profound intellect.
Well,
and if he has author.
Yeah, if he has such reach and money, why couldn't he have preserved some documents of, if he was Shakespeare, right? Why couldn't he have preserved them for, future generations? Was it just really he couldn't imagine what the future was, and he imagined that the future would be just like it was for him that year, that you would just never reveal that to the public. You would just think that he would save it for posterity's sake or something.
Yeah, well, he was the victim of a hoax. He didn't. I think he knew that the pen name would live forever, because there's a mention of it in one of his sonnets. He tells the fair youth, the young man in the sonnets, "Your name will live forever, but mine will die." That's what he says. And how would that make sense? Unless his name was a pen name. So I think that the pen name he knew was going to live forever. What I don't think he thought would be that they later on force the powers that be would confuse him with the Stratford Man. He didn't expect that, I don't think. I think that he thought people would eventually figure it out that he was the great author, because his plays are so autobiographical, especially Hamlet. One great instance in Hamlet is on his way back from England, his ship gets attacked by pirates and he loses everything. He's almost stripped naked. Mm-hmm. And the exact incident happened with the Earl of Oxford. After he took his grand tour of Europe, he was coming home, crossing the Channel, and the same thing happened. He lost everything. So, and he almost was killed too. So that was an international incident.
But there are other mysterious aspects about Shakespeare, and it makes you wonder if this was, Edward, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Is there more? What else do we know about his personality? Because he's so insightful, and able to see through the eyes of men and women. It's very and evil and good. I mean, he kind of like hits all layers of the psyche. And there are some people that think that maybe Shakespeare was a woman. Because there are things that are said, like being frustrated with being a woman in their place and not being able to, if I can, so like Rosalind and As You Like It, will have a swashing and a martial outside, as many other mannish cowards have that do outface it with their semblances. Kate in Taming of the Shrew, my tongue will tell the anger of my heart, or else my heart concealing it will break. As a woman, she couldn't speak out because of her place, right? Now, as a man in that society, you wouldn't want to be writing like that, right? So whether the author is a male or a female, you would want to conceal who you are, because you're empowering women to a degree. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know about that, but he certainly knew very powerful women. And the most powerful of all was Queen Elizabeth I. He was very close to her. He was her favorite when he was in his early 20s. In fact, it was even noted in a letter by Mary, Queen of Scots, that they had a romance going on. Yeah. So she was probably the most powerful woman in England.
So he could have learned from her.
I'm sorry?
He could have learned from her.
Yes,
right?
And he could have. I think he based some of his characters upon her too, and he also he was obsessed with Anne Vavasor, who was a real hot number at the court. She was a real seducer, and he was obsessed with her. And if you read the sonnets, several of them are to a dark lady, and Anne Vavasor was a very dark lady, unusually dark hair, dark eyes. And yes, I think he knew powerful women. I think he was portraying powerful women. I mean, imagine he portrayed Portia in The Merchant of Venice. You know, she wasn't going to take her new husband's friend. She wasn't going to allow him to be taken down by having his flesh cut off. She went to the court herself, dressed up as a man, and saved him through legal means, you know. So, I mean, that was an extraordinary portrayal for any time period, you know, until, you know, maybe the 20th century. So, yeah, he knew all the people in the court, and he was also satirizing them. Although he was, you know, praising some, he was satirizing others. And I think that type of political angle is what powerful people wanted to decontextualize the works, so no one would see that. The Stratford Man, he had no connections at court. How can he accurately portray some of these people? So if you throw the authorship on him, they'll never see it. But if the world knew that it was the Earl of Oxford, a nobleman within the court, you're going to see these portrayals. One great example is Polonius in Hamlet. He was the king's minister, top minister. Historians have seen Lord Burleigh as a caricature, a lampooning in Polonius. That they were the most powerful family in England, his family.
Yeah.
So there's motives.
Yeah, and I had the chance to play Rosencrantz in Hamlet, and Hamlet's it's funny. It was a shorter version of Hamlet, but it was we really enjoyed doing it. And you know, once you get through the not his version of tripping over the words, but once you get through our version of tripping over the words, there's so much more behind Shakespeare. So, okay, let's say he's the Earl of Oxford, right? And he speaks to influential people. He understands politics. He's extremely educated. He's close with Elizabeth and has an understanding of a woman's point of view. How does that? But that doesn't necessarily make him the intellectual that he is, right? That doesn't make him the sensitive person that he is, that empathetic person. Is there anything in Edward's upbringing that would indicate he was nurtured in some way that would alter his way of viewing the world?
Well, you know, honestly, I can't tell you, but he, when he was 12, he lost his father. And so that may have affected him. And within a couple years, his mother remarried. And I think that he was somebody who felt deeply on every topic, the great author. And I think that there were maybe some early tragedies in his life that may have, you know, taken him there.
I see. We have a question from Dave Zumo. Are there any similarities between the Earl of Oxford and Shakespeare's writing?
Yes, there are several letters that have survived of the Earl of Oxford, and they do have a Shakespearean tone. Someone wrote a book, his name is Fowler, showing all the parallels between phrases in the Earl of Oxford's letters and Shakespeare lines. So similar word usage and phrasing. Yes.
Now, do you think he would have been careful to not use the same phrasing?
No, I don't think there was any need. You know, he wasn't out there printing these works on his own. You know, these were court entertainments that later ended up getting printed.
We have another comment by Ojo. Maybe the Stratford Man did an adaptation from the original novel created by the Count as playwriting. So could the Stratford Man have sort of copied Shakespeare's work?
Well, I think the first thing we have to address is, was he literate? And the Stratford Man, as far as we know, was not. Those based on the 6 signatures that we do have, it appears that he could barely hold a pen. There's no evidence he was educated. There's no evidence that he knew anybody in the court at all. So his access wouldn't have been there either. So
Okay.
yes, I don't think it was that way at all. Yeah.
Do you think people are losing touch with literature and Shakespeare? Do you think less and less people study and understand the poetry?
Well, yes. I mean, there is an initial barrier because it is the language is, somewhat in some ways archaic, in other ways very modern. You can read it. But it's the density of the language, as you were mentioning. It's he would do all these puns. You wouldn't even know there were punning going on. And he had deep knowledge of Greek and Roman mythology and history. He had all these, and he was making references in his works. And there's these references, you're not going to catch on the first try. Sure. You need to read an annotated version of a play to catch everything, and then read the play, and then you might begin to appreciate the depth of his knowledge and his incredible metaphors. And yeah, it's too bad that a lot of the universities are sort of somewhat phasing him out, not being a requirement in English literature. That's the trend, as I understand it. But I hope that these plays are so classic that I think people are still going to keep reading them.
Well, it's kind of like the Greek plays, right, and tragedies. Yes. They're never going to go away.
Yeah, few thousand years old,
Yeah, and they're still here. Now, granted, he borrowed from that. So do many other writers. But his originality definitely stands the test of time. And I think most people would know a sonnet like 18, right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
Oh, yes.
Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough wings do shake the darling buds of May. It's so beautiful. Now, and it's interesting because you were speaking of another sonnet earlier, how his one name will expire, right? And another name will live on. And even in this sonnet here, he says, when in internal lines to time thou growest, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
Yes, he was convinced his works would live forever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, just not his name, unfortunately. And he was right. But it's time to correct that.
Well, how do you? Okay, you've written this great work, Shakespeare Suppressed, which anyone out there who's interested, please go to Amazon and check that out. Or you can go to shakespearesuppressed.com. And then now, what's the next step? Is it just you have to reach out to more and more scholars and try to just keep this conversation going?
Yes, that's basically all we can do. We've tried to challenge academia, and they just think we're a member of the Flat Earth Society, and they don't even want to talk to us. Really, it's. I mean, they have on occasion, but kind of with their tongue, and their cheek, maybe, I think that what we need to do is just get it out to the public, get it out to students, and have the students start asking their professors, what's going on with this authorship controversy? Tell us about it, because they never talk about it in university. I mean, whenever I took a course, in literature or in art history, you would get a brief biography of the artist that you're talking about, but they usually skip biography of Shakespeare because there is no biography. Oh yeah, these are a few.
Well, when we were studying, I don't ever remember coming out of it thinking they knew who Shakespeare was, and I guess that depends on who your teacher or professor is, right? Because some professors might just be like, well, we don't really know. Anyway, let's focus on the work.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. And then
Exactly.
others are like, no, this is who he is. Because don't we need sometimes someone to attribute something we love to, to put someone on a pedestal?
It could be. I think maybe a lot of professors are kind of in love with the idea that he was somebody of humble origins who made it on his own through, hard work and study and stuff like that. But the problem is we don't know how he had access to the hundreds of books that are evident in the works that he must have read and known about. They didn't have public libraries back then. The Earl of Oxford, however, was very fortunate not only to go to a few universities, but he was raised in the household of the Queen's top minister, Lord Burleigh. And he had an enormous library. We know all the volumes in that library. We have records of those books. Yeah. And here he was in that very house. So he must have gone crazy reading the library. Cecil's library, yes.
Yeah, and I can't help but ask about the supernatural aspects of some of his works. Considering the time period and the predominant religion of England being Christianity, he doesn't seem to be very judgmental of paganism, supernatural occurrences. It kind of just seems like it's a part of the worlds that he builds. And he's not, denouncing any of these things. He's just writing about them and building them into the storyline to make it interesting, to add a little flair and drama. But the three witches are they're pretty wise, right? So it's like they're not demon spirits, and at least in my reading of it, that's not how he presents it. So what does that tell us about him in that regard?
Well, the Earl of Oxford was early on very interested in these topics. We have a testimony. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. John Dee. He was the Queen's astrologer, and he was interested in a variety of topics. He also had a huge library, and he mentioned the Earl of Oxford in 1570 that they had a correspondence. So he certainly was interested. And then about 10 years later, the Earl of Oxford was accused of being a Catholic convert, you could say, which wasn't a good thing back then.
You might as well be a pagan.
Yeah. And so anyway, he had these accusers, and they also, he told on them, really. That was the reason. He exposed to Queen Elizabeth that there was a Catholic plot against her. Yeah. So their response was to start calling him names. And one of the things that they called him was that he would draw up spirits, the spirit of his stepfather. So, I mean, whether it was true or not, it sort of indicates that he did have interest in ghosts and, spirits and things like that. And of course, they're shown in the Shakespeare plays in Macbeth and several other plays. A ghost will appear, Hamlet. Yes. So
it seems to
he
me
did have that interest.
Yeah, it seems to me that astrology has kind of always found its way, right? To nobles or to all kinds of people throughout history. It never just disappeared. These other alternative ways of communing with reality or the supernatural have always been there. They've never been cleanly wiped off by any one religion. And so I guess that makes sense. If he was dabbling in that a little bit, that he felt comfortable writing about that. Now, if you were to compare his works with others of that time period, what would you say stands out most? It's probably a lot, but what would you say stands out most from Shakespeare from the others?
Well, I think his characters are so well developed and so real. One professor wrote a book called Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, which I think is an accurate statement. I think he portrayed human beings for the first time. in full personality.
Sure.
And he had sympathy, or you mentioned empathy, for his characters, even the evil ones, like Richard III. He kind of gave a justification for their becoming evil. I mean, the first opening pages of Richard III, he tells you why he's going to do these terrible things.
Sure. Even King Lear, right? I mean, you feel bad for him. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And
by the way, we were very lucky to see Ian McKellen do King Lear in New York City, full frontal nude. It was an honor of a lifetime.
Oh, wow.
He just went, like, part of his character was just, he went crazy, like took off his clothes.
Yes.
But Ian McKellen, oh my God, one of the best.
Yes. Well, an interesting parallel with Oxford is he did have 3 daughters, and his family seat, Castle Hedingham, he had to make that away from himself, and he gave it to his daughters through their grandfather, who was Lord Burleigh. So that's kind of a little bit of a parallel too. And also Oxford, when he inherited the earldom when he was 12, he had maybe close to 100 estates. But by the time of his death, he only had like 1 or 2 left, So he really ended up in a way like Lear, with nothing.
Is there any evidence that actors of the time period were particularly excited to do his work?
There was an actor who was known to have done Hamlet, Richard Burbage. He was known for that. Contemporary writers were very enthusiastic of Shakespeare.
And, but we don't really know how they
admired his works.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Sometimes a little bit of a delay. But the actors, they, we don't know how they really felt, I guess, about Shakespeare's work.
I can't tell you. I don't. We don't. We don't have interviews with actors.
Right. There's no extra.
The names of some of the actors that played. Edward Allen probably played Henry VI or a character in that play, and Richard Burbage did Hamlet. So there's a few scraps. In the folio book that we were talking about, there was a list of actor names in there too, but they also wrote on that list William Shakespeare. But of course, that was
Avalon.
Posthumous. We don't know. We don't know if he was an actor in his own plays. Yes.
Well, if it was Edward, there's really no evidence that he was an actor either, except for that he was funny.
Well, there was evidence that he acted before Queen Elizabeth. We do have that much. But if you look at, again, the sonnets, which are him talking about himself, he referred to himself as making himself a motley to the view, which was motley was the costume of a clown. So he kind of gave the impression that he was acting too. So he could have been this grand nobleman in disguise in front of the groundlings.
Right.
Who knows?
Well, okay, so men could, dress as women to act, right? Because women, for the most part, weren't supposed to.
No, women were not allowed to at that time.
So, is it conceivable that he just kind of disguised himself as well?
Yes, I think to really get to know get good character studies, I think he would go out in disguise, as a commoner and listen. Because even some of the middle class is very much realistically portrayed, and unfortunately the lower classes are more of comic figures, which you would think that if the great author were the Stratford Man, he would give a little bit more.
Right.
make them the hero now and then. But that didn't happen. Most of Shakespeare's heroes and heroines were of the nobility or upper class or a king or queen,
Yeah, like carrying the queen on what are those, like the four posts?
The canopy.
The canopies, thank you. Yes.
Yes.
He critiques that, right? Or
yes, and again, a line of Sonnet 124, he says, "Were it aught to me, I held the canopy." And ought means anything. So did it mean anything to me to carry the canopy? Well, the canopy was something that you would hold over Queen Elizabeth. Four people who were officials or titled people would have the honor of holding one of the four poles over Queen Elizabeth. It was a tremendous honor. And here you have the great author saying, oh, did it mean anything to me that I did that? So that sounds like a bored courtier, not someone with humble origins being given this great honor. So,
right. Why do you think Romeo and Juliet is the predominantly most popular of plays?
Well, it's a wonderful love story, isn't it?
Yeah, I get it, right?
I mean, it was actually based, I believe, on a 14th century story that endured till the 16th century, and Shakespeare just really really immortalized it.
Right. So based on a real story.
Yes. I think it was based on a real story. Yes.
Wow.
In the 14th century.
Yeah. Do you think Shakespeare ever found love? Like the love?
Yes, I do. I think it was the Dark Lady who pretty much betrayed him in the end. But yeah, I believe she was Anne Vavasor, and he was married when he had this affair with Anne Vavasor, and had a child by her. And the child was even named after him, Edward. So a bastard child with his name. I mean, I don't think he would have allowed his name to be given if it wasn't somebody he was deeply in love with. But in the end, she betrayed him. I think he loved Queen Elizabeth too, very much. And she had other guys, boyfriends that I believe, favorites, that she also saw. So I think he may have had a little bit of a jaundiced viewpoint about women. And I think that shows in the plays. But his second marriage, I think, was a happy one in his later years.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that he was a spiritual person. Would you?
That's a good question. You don't get a lot of religion in the works.
I don't mean in religion. No.
Yes.
No. But as a state of mind, that there's sort of this belief in, there's an optimism of humanity in his work. And I think that is powerful. And do you feel that from him as well?
Yes, I do get that. Yes.
Yeah.
A sense of optimism and a sense that good will prevail.
Right.
Perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. Even with terrible things going on. Yeah.
Catherine, I'm sorry. I wish we had more time, but this is it. I was trying to get us to cover as much as we could in an hour, and my gosh, I'm really surprised there's so much more. But unfortunately, the clock has gotten us.
Yes.
Before I let you go, is there anything you would like to leave us with, whether it's regard to Shakespeare or life, whatever it is?
Well, I just I'm on a mission, to tell as many people as possible about the Earl of Oxford and Shakespeare, and I just hope that I'm reaching out to younger people, because there's a lot of older people in our movement, and we need to carry this movement forward and until it's finally resolved. I hope it'll be resolved in my lifetime. But there is a great website, an organization called ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. Mm-hmm. There's my website, ShakespeareSuppressed.com. There's doubtaboutwill.org. Untitled.org. That's a great organization where you can read the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt against the Stratford Man. You can see all the celebrities and people who have signed this declaration. You can sign it yourself.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's basically it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, have a good night.
You too.
All right. Thank you all for hanging with us tonight. This was really fun. We were all over the place, covering everything from the most worldly to the most otherworldly. And thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. To find out more about Katherine's work, please go to ShakespeareSuppressed.com. You've been listening to Paranormal Now live Sundays, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on KGRA DB, your official contact for the best in alternative talk radio. Thank you very much to the head of operations, Eric Brager, my producer, Bill Skywatcher. Stay tuned for Tracy Austin. And until next time, everyone, live in the mystery.